One day, little Noah comes home from religious school, and his mother asks him what he learned. Noah says, "Today we were learning about how the Israelites left Egypt." His mother says, "Great, tell me about that." And Noah says, "Well, Pharaoh wasn't going to let the people go. So Moses called in these airstrikes and destroyed Pharaoh's entire air force. Finally, the Israelites had a chance to escape. So they started running toward the Suez Canal. But Pharaoh changed his mind and started to come after them with tanks mounted with large guns. When the Israelites got to the Suez Canal, it looked like there was nowhere to go. But Pharaoh called his engineers and they set up an enormous pontoon bridge. And the Israelites were able to go across. On their way, they booby-trapped it. And when the last Israelite got over to the other side, Moses pushed a button and the whole thing exploded, and all of Pharaoh's tanks fell right into the canal and sank." Noah's mother doesn't know what to say. After a moment, she asks, "Is that really what you learned in Hebrew school today, Noah?" "No," Noah says quietly, "but you never would have believed it the way the teacher told it." We read this week in the Torah about the miracle of the splitting of the sea, Kriyat Yam Suf, this tremendous miracle that the Torah describes. And a lot of you are asking, what really happened there? What am I supposed to believe? It's easy to be like the child in the story. One fantastic account is just the same as another. It's so hard in our world without miracles like that to know what to do with biblical stories of miracles like the splitting of the sea. If you do wonder what you're supposed to think and believe about this miracle, you're not alone. In fact, every major Jewish philosopher has struggled with the question, and rabbis since the Talmud. If you look at major books of systematic Jewish philosophy, modern and even medieval, often you'll find absolutely nothing about miracles. Rabbi Moses Maimonides, the Rambam, the greatest Jewish philosopher, went to great lengths to say that nature always works the way the nature works. Olam keminhago noheg. I heard Rabbi David Hartman teach once that for Maimonides, there was really just a single miracle, which was the creation of the universe. After that, when we encounter something we think is miraculous, Maimonides thought there were only two possibilities. One is that we just don't understand what happened well enough, so we chalk it up to divine intervention. In time, we could figure it out, or later generations might get to a natural or scientific explanation. This is true, Maimonides says, even for miracles that the Torah describes. I bet if Rambam lived in an age with quantum physics, he'd say about the splitting sea, well, such a thing has almost a zero probability, but there is a very small chance, or one version of the multiverse that's just like ours, except that at one moment, all the particles in the sea just happen to arrange themselves in these two sections. The other possibility for Maimonides is that the miracle was actually programmed into the world at creation as a single exception to the usual laws of nature. The miracle was prearranged on a timer. That way, it's possible to say that no new miracles ever happen, technically. It just seems new. Maimonides quotes Rabbi Yochanan from the Talmud, who said that when all the seas were created on the third day in Genesis, God made their reality conditional. They could only exist if they agreed that one particular sea would split for the Israelites on the day of Yetziat Mitzrayim, the day of the Exodus. You can see that these two rabbis, Rambam and Rabbi Yochanan in the Talmud, are uncomfortable about something. I think what they really don't like is the idea that God is somehow clicking in and out of touch with the world and with us, with human suffering. I don't think the scientific thing is their main problem. It's a spiritual problem and even a moral problem. They want the divine with us all the time, the same way, every day. Why should one day be different, or one nation, or one group suffering as opposed to another, or one individual, for that matter? Miracles are great when they happen, but they don't always. If you believe in miracles and don't get one, that's not just disappointing, but it's cruel. It's God being cruel. Rabbi Yochanan and Rambam aren't asking how miracles are possible. They are really asking, why not a miracle any other time too? So their answer is to say that the miracle of the sea actually is all the time. It was there from the start and exists all the time in this sense. It's either happening or it's waiting to happen, or we remember that it happened. A miracle is perceived at a point in time, but it's always there. I know that might sound like just playing games with words and concepts of time. So let me say more what I think makes sense about this perspective. It's so appropriate that our parsha represents the miracle as a sea. There are always waves in a sea, and sometimes waves converge and turn into something dramatically taller and more powerful for an instant. Then, when such a wave falls and actually disappears, and maybe even the water plunges lower than where it started, the power of the wave continues to be felt. It keeps pressing outward when the crest has gone, and it ripples in all directions. The miracle of the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, was exactly like that. It was a time when two things converged in a way you couldn't ignore. Something natural and something profoundly ideal converged. Something unusual happened to water, and something even more unusual happened to people. Who ever heard of slaves being rescued out from under a king by a god? When had someone ever come to stop that kind of suffering before God came to the Israelites? This wave fell, but it continued to change everyone who saw it, and then rippled out and changed everywhere affected by it, and it continues to affect everyone who hears a story about it. A miracle is something that stands out from regular experience because it's where the world we have and the world we dream of suddenly overlap. And we're surprised into hope, or we are brought back to hope, to believing in what is possible because in some sense it's built into creation. It's true that, as the Talmud says, we can't rely on miracles in the superficial sense, ein somchim al hanes. But we can be changed by experiencing a miracle or witnessing a miracle, or even by hearing about one. Miracles are always about compassion, about powerful chesed. We don't bother to tell stories about things that are just unusual spectacles. The Torah certainly doesn't. We say it's a miracle when someone has a dramatic recovering from an illness, which also meant that people had rallied to them and caregivers had gone all out for them, and maybe researchers had found an unlikely therapy or cure. Miracles are about overflowing concern, a community showing up with meals for someone sick or displaced, or money raised in tremendous amounts after a tragedy or a crisis. Miracles are about rescue, just as with God and Bnei Israel at the sea. And whether we tell it like the Torah as the hand of God or not, a miracle is a portal where divine concern suddenly rushes into our world out of proportion to what we believed was possible. My colleague and teacher, Rabbi Sharon Brous, out in Los Angeles, shared this story one year around Hanukkah, the Festival of Miracles. A story she learned from the journalist Nicholas Kristof and his wife Cheryl Wudun, who lived in China in the 1990s. Rabbi Brous said, they met a skinny young girl named Dai Manju, who lived with her family in a home with no electricity, no water, no possessions of any sort, and a giant pig. Despite her desperate poverty, she was a star student in her rural elementary school, a 4-mile walk from her home. By the time Dai Manju reached 6th grade, her parents could no longer afford the $13 tuition to her school, so she was forced to drop out. But she dreamt of becoming the first person in her family to complete elementary school. So she would stand outside the schoolhouse picking up scraps of paper, hoping to learn something, even though her parents could not pay. Kristof wrote a story in the New York Times about Dai Manju. Moved by the column, a reader donated $10,000 to pay for her education. The school was ecstatic. It not only covered Dai Manju's tuition, but gave them the opportunity to construct a proper school building and provide scholarships for all the girls in the region. Kristof contacted the donor to offer a report saying, you wouldn't believe how much difference $10,000 will make in a Chinese village. But I didn't give $10,000, the donor replied. I gave $100. It turned out that the bank had made a processing error, accidentally wiring over $10,000 rather than $100, a matter of a misplaced decimal point. But when confronted with the necessity of shutting down the village school in order to retrieve the money, the bank graciously offered the difference as a donation. Dai Manju finished elementary, high school, and accounting school. She found a job as an accountant and then helped a number of old friends from the village get jobs as well. She sent home so much money to her parents, they became among the wealthiest villagers. Her friends, who had benefited from the scholarships as well, also got good jobs, and were able to send home money to support their families too. By the time Dai Manju was 30, she was an executive in a large corporation and thinking of starting her own company. Rabbi Brass teaches this was a miracle, a series of miracles. At each point, some chesed had to win out over the yetzer hara, over someone's selfishness or narrowness, or the possibility that someone would just not pay attention anymore. We want and we hope and we pray that the world would work like this. Sometimes it does. When it does, and when we notice it and celebrate it and tell it again and again, that's what makes a miracle. You may have noticed in the Torah that there are two groups of people who sang after the miracle at the sea. The men sang with Moshe, and the women, led by Miriam, sang and danced with tambourines. According to Midrash, the women brought tambourines to the sea with them, and the men didn't. And it's because only the women were ready to believe that the miracle of redemption was going to happen. They were ready because they had already been telling miracle stories, even during their slavery. Stories of the midwives who defied Pharaoh to save baby boys. Stories of Yocheved and Miriam who dared to talk to Pharaoh's daughter and raise baby Moshe. For the women with tambourines, the miracle at the sea was already real, even before it happened. It was kind of the same miracle they already knew. The women had been changed by miracles, and for them, it was just a question of when again the real world and the ideal world would overlap and inspire them and give them one more story to tell. We can't make miracles anytime, in the sense that we can't make the waves of the real and the ideal crest and swell together just any time, no matter how much we believe and no matter how hard we try. But when we do perceive a miracle, we realize that the world can be a place where the right choices are rewarded, where it's not just the mighty and powerful who come out on top again and again, where dreams for what is really important are made possible by the compassion of others. This is why we come back to the Torah's miracles. That's why the miracle of the Exodus is in our prayers morning and evening, day after day, and even more on Shabbat. Miracles like the one at the sea are revealed at a point in time, but they are built in from the beginning, and in that sense are always happening or waiting to happen, or we remember they happened. The important question isn't really scientific or historical. It's a spiritual question and a moral challenge. Miracles and miracle stories strengthen the part of us that wants to hope. Telling these miracles, praying them, pushes us to live miraculously, to do our part to make the world that is become the world that is supposed to be.